We're going to move on to Mick McGrath. He's the Director of DevOps for Bitovi. Containerization and microservices can be challenging to coordinate, especially with local development. In his talk, Mick's going to show us how to use Docker Compose to reduce the headache of developing microservices.
Last time we talked about like why maybe it would be a good idea to use Docker, especially with microservice development, for things like easier deploying to container orchestrators like Kubernetes or Elastic Container Service and that kind of stuff. And so the guide that we went through showed off like some kind of raw scripts for starting up for hooking together a Docker environment with a network and stuff like that. And so basically we're going to be building on that. This was basically the last talk here. How to build the Docker containers locally, what the Docker containers are and that kind of stuff. So we're going to pick up from where we left off, and we're going to use Docker Compose. At the end of the last session, somebody asked, well, why not just use Docker Compose? So I thought it'd be good, like, let's show that. All right, so now this is the Docker Compose one. It's pretty much the same thing. So we have some, like, the only prerequisite that we need for running Docker Compose is Docker. If you install via the command line, I think you'll have to install Docker Compose separately from Docker, but if you install it with one of the options from just docker.com install or whatever, the desktop for Mac or Windows, whichever you're running on, it should come with Docker. Docker Compose should. Cool. So we've got three files here. I'm not going to go too in depth to these, and one I'm going to skip altogether. We'll come back maybe in the next talk. We can talk about like how to do continuous integration stuff through Docker, because that's pretty nifty too. But we're going to focus on the Docker file and the Docker file for the API. So just to back up a little bit, this, if you're not familiar with it, this is the Place My Order app from DoneJS. It's like an example application that shows how to do a lot of the concepts inside of DoneJS, and it's just a nice example app that we're going to be using. So I'm not doing anything with the app itself. I'm just wrapping it up in Docker so that we can use it. So it has two pieces that are of importance. One's the front end, one's the back end. The back end does actually live in another repo, but we're going to be using it from our repo. So just a bit of background there. There are two pieces to this, but the Place My Order app has a script inside of it that is for the API. So it's got a CLI piece in here. So we're not actually going to be using the other repo. We're just going to be using the Place My Order and sort of like running the API from within this. So anyway, take a look at the Place My Order repo and play around with that. That's what we're Dockerizing. All right, so back to the piece here. Check out the last video for all the details of what's going on here, but essentially all I'm doing here is wrapping this up in a Docker container. So we've got one for the front end and one for the back end, and really the only difference is whenever the containers are started up, one is going to say DoneJS develop Docker, and one is going to say DoneJS API. And so that's whenever we do like a Docker run. So now the only real difference between last time and this time is that instead of running these customized scripts, we're going to use Docker Compose. So now to build the app, we just say Docker Compose build. And then let me refresh this too, because I think I had some updates. Yeah, okay, cool. So Docker Compose build, we'll build it. I'll go over what that means and what that does here in a second. And then to run the app, you do Docker Compose up, and Docker Compose just does it all for you. All right, so let's see this actually, what this actually looks like. So in order to get this set up, you need obviously the Docker file, which I kind of outlined a minute ago. And then we have the two Docker files. We have the one for the front end and the one for the back end. So we have our Docker files, and these are what Docker is going to use to actually build it. And so the way then to compose this in Docker Compose is you have a docker-compose.yml. So this is the naming convention that Docker Compose looks for. And then in order to utilize this, you'll cd into a directory that has docker-compose, and then you can use the CLI tool docker-compose. Cool, yeah, so this is it. So what we have, we specify our version, and then we specify our services. And so we have two services. One is the Place My Order API, and then one is the Place My Order front end. And so then the build piece to this, so whenever this builds, whenever Place My Order API builds, we want to say, look in the current directory, so the same directory as the Docker Compose YAML, and pick out the Dockerfile-API Docker file. So that would be this one, right? So this service is going to be built and run with this Docker file. Now you can also do external services. Say I had something like Postgres. You can actually, you don't have to build Postgres if you're just pulling that from somewhere else. I'm not going to go into how to do that, but you can basically just specify an image for Postgres, and it's not a local image. It will, Docker Compose will like pull it down. And there are ways of specifying like repull and specifying tags and stuff. But in our case, we want to just use this local directory because we're doing this for local development purposes. And so we're going to build the current directory, look in the current directory for this Docker file. And then to expose the ports, we use this pattern to where this says the host port 7070 is going to map to the client port, or the image, the running container port. So this is host and container. And then this exposes it externally. I don't think we actually need this, but this is how you would do that. So that on your host, so on your Mac or whatever computer you're using, you could do localhost 7070, and then that would point you to this service. Okay, and then the front end is very similar. We're using the shorthand syntax of build because Docker under the hood looks for this capital D Docker file. So if you don't specify context in Docker file, it'll just use the Docker file by default, and expose some ports. And now the interesting thing, because we're using this for local development, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we can change some code and have that reflected in the application. And so I'll come back and explain this for a second, but while that's while we're waiting, why don't I just go ahead and show, now that we have this Docker Compose file put together, all we need to do is we're in the Place My Order app repo, and we just do Docker Compose up. And so what this will do, if you remember from last time we actually created in the start script we created a network. So whenever we ran it last time, we said, okay, well, we need to create a network, and then we need to run this container, and then we need to run this container. So Docker Compose just puts all this together for you. And so we don't have to create the network. You can create multiple networks and specify them and things like that, but we are not doing that this time. And usually Docker Compose doesn't take too long. I think I'm like pretty high use on my memory at the moment. So, don't lay that on Docker Compose necessarily. Okay, so this is up and running. Whenever you do Docker Compose up, it's going to start up all the services. You see the log output. This is the service name, and it's got this _1 in case you have multiple instances of these things running, and then the logs from that. So all of the logs from the actual running application will be output here, and you can see that in this running terminal. So yeah, let's check it out. So this is, we can go over to localhost 8080. And it'll come up. Cool. So this is it. This is the running app running from Docker Compose. And the only thing in the entire Place My Order, the only thing that I did is added 2 Docker files and a Docker Compose.yml file, essentially. Like that's the only thing that changed in order to Dockerify Place My Order. Okay, so now the only like what happens if like you want to change something you want to actually develop with this. So that was like I showed. We have these volumes. So basically, what the volumes do is it'll make it so that your directory is available inside of the container at the location that you specify. And so you can sort of map your host file system contents in your host file system to contents inside of the container. So in this case, we want to do dot, which is the the same directory that Docker Compose YAML is in, and then we want to map that to /user/source/app inside of the running container. And I'm picking this value because this is defined by us in the Docker file. So the Docker file says, here's my working directory. Whenever the Docker container or the Docker image is built, all of the files will be copied over to this directory. So this is saying this is where we want our app to live. Copy everything from the host to inside of the image. And then this dot is already set to the context of the working directory. Yeah, so then whenever we actually start up the container, we want to say, all right, now we're starting it up. We want to put this directory as a live mount inside of the user/source/app. And so the one challenge with this is that we don't actually have like node modules, for example. So whenever the Docker container is built, it does the npm install inside of the image, and node modules will be inside of the image. But then whenever we come up and say, all right, let's start up the container, we want to basically make this directory available at this location inside of the app or inside of the container. Well, Docker's like, all right, here you go. It's going to put this there, and now we don't have node modules anymore that we had whenever the application was built. And so to get around this, and by the way, if you look in there's a pull request for this, but if you look in the README, it will kind of walk you through. There's some details on exactly what's going on. But to get around this, essentially what we do is we say, all right, well, since basically we've hidden our node modules by overlaying this on top of that directory, we're going to say, well, Docker, then how about you just give it back, essentially. So this is like a runtime mount from inside the container to inside the container. That all it's doing is just saying, like, make sure this is there. Like I said, look into, we can talk about it more and look into the links. It does a better explanation than I think I did just now. But anyway, now what we should be able to do, because we have, all right, Docker Compose is up and running. Let's say, well, management comes down and they say, well, we want, instead of restaurants, we want to do locations. Maybe we're not just a restaurant, place my order anymore. We just have locations in various places. And so inside of the app, why don't we just go ahead and change that name? So in source components, and here's like a header component. We'll say, all right, well, instead of restaurants, let's say locations. Sure. All right, so save that. And you can see in here, there's some reloading stuff happening. And if I refresh the page, we now have locations. So this is Docker Compose running the place my order application in real time, and we can change things. So one other thing that I'll mention is sometimes, what if I need a like another dependency? And so if your node modules like exist beforehand, and then like this is currently running, and you instead of having to stop Docker Compose and start it back up, there is a way to like run scripts inside of an existing container. It's the way to do that is with Docker Compose run. Well, I don't have it, so I'll just do Docker Compose. You'll do run, and then the name of the service. So in this case, let's say we want to add a node module to a node module dependency to place my order. So then we do run, the name of the service, and this will allow you to execute commands inside of that container. So now all we need to do is say npm install something. Let's whatever the dependency is. Let's say JSDoc or so. And so what this will do is inside of the container for place my order, it will do an npm install JSDoc. And actually, let me well, I meant to do a dash dash save on there, but you can do a dash dash save, and then that would actually change the package JSON as well, because it's bound to it. And so you can actually make real-time changes, and they're reflected both in the host and in the container. And now maybe it's time to head over to why you would want to do this. So it seems like it's pretty simple to set up. It's pretty easy to do, and that's one of the main reasons. And so one of the main reasons is, onboarding is now a lot quicker. So essentially all you would need to do, if somebody else comes in and wants to work with this, is you just clone the repo CD into it and you do Docker compose up. You're good to go. You don't have to have any other dependencies on your host other than Docker. Like all of the databases and everything that exists inside of a Docker container can exist within the Docker compose. And you can just assume that your machine has nothing on it except for Docker and a code editor of some kind, whether that's a terminal or an IDE or whatever. That's all you need. That's literally all you need to develop pretty much anything in the modern age. And then the other really nice thing about it, one reason that we're leaning on it with one of our main clients, is that it provides us environment parity. So we're deploying to Kubernetes, and Kubernetes is like, you have microservices, they're distributed. It's more difficult to have them communicate with each other, and you can orchestrate all that with Docker Compose and give you some a local running version that has all of the microservices up and running in Docker container, communicating with each other in a local way, so that you can reproduce issues and things like that and develop locally. Cool. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much it. Let me see if I can get go ahead and do that so that you can see the package JSON changing. But while that is running, what questions do we have?
I've got a question. I noticed a couple of comments in there about how you would change it to work in production. But would you normally have two separate Docker files, one for production and one for development, or how do you normally handle that?
You can do that with environment variables. And I can't remember the syntax offhand, but you can, like what you would probably want to do, or I think the way that I would approach it, is you would have an environment variable. You would like expose this environment variable to be able to be accessed outside of the container. And then whenever you start the container, that's when you specify, here, use this environment variable, whether it's development or production. And then your start script, whatever it is, would just like somewhere in the internals in there, it would know if that environment variable is there, start it in one mode or the other.
So you would put that conditional logic in your start script, either in your package JSON or a separate script.
Right, based on an environment variable. So like that's, and that's, I guess maybe a good bigger point is that like environment variable configuration is like largely the pattern to do in most cases with Docker container development. It provides ease of configuration. So everything that is configurable, if you can bubble that up to an environment variable, then it's going to be a lot more straightforward, I think, to work with in a deployed environment.
Cool, thanks.
Yep.
So I think I heard you say something about using Docker Compose with Kubernetes. Now, I probably just have some fundamental misunderstanding here, but I was under the impression that if you were using Kubernetes, you didn't really need something like Docker Compose.
Yeah, so that's definitely a good point. So it's possible I overlaid some concepts there. So we're using Docker Compose for local development. It's not as easy to use Kubernetes for local development. It's possible, it's doable, and there are advances being made to make that easier to do. But it's a lot more straightforward for most developers who aren't familiar with Kubernetes to look at a Docker. Like all there is the Docker file, which has steps in it that are pretty relatable to what they're used to working with in their environment. And then the Docker Compose file itself is just a YAML file that itself is pretty straightforward to follow, well documented and everything. Whereas if you were to want to try to use Kubernetes locally, there are things like Minikube and things like that but iteratively making changes and redeploying and that kind of stuff is, you know, takes a little bit more to get set up. Like I said, Google's making some advances toward that. I can't remember what the package is called, but they just released something to help with, like, you know, iterative development of Kubernetes. But you're right, you wouldn't want to use Docker Compose, or you probably wouldn't use Docker Compose and Kubernetes outside of a local development environment in tandem necessarily. Like, if you're using one, you probably won't want to have the other one too, in most cases, I would think. I'm sure there are exceptions for everything, but does that answer your question?
Yeah, that totally does. Thank you. I appreciate it.
So this, real quick, I just did the -s save. So if we look at the status and see what we did change. So, you know, I manually changed the header component value, and then the package JSON has, check it out, this new JS doc in there, because I did the --save dev. Cool. And one more note, actually, because we're wrapping up, now we're done. Control C, and that'll start shutting everything down, and then you'll want to do Docker Compose down, which is also documented. But once this will, like, gracefully try to shut everything down, and then once all that's done, then you can do Docker Compose down, and that will make sure to, like, clean up your images and remove your network and that kind of stuff. So now we're done.